Hello, this is Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com, setting the record straight about climate. One of the goals of climate alarmists is always to create primal fear. Fear that you're going to burn up, fear that you're going to drown. They've done this particularly effectively with children like Greta Thunburg, who's now too scared to go to school. Essentially, every school child in the world has been shown Al Gore's sci-fi flick, and the intent was to make them scared. Mark Twain famously said, there are three kinds of lies: lies, damn lies, and statistics. In this video I'm going to show how NASA creates fake sea level graphs in their efforts to scare adults and children. Climate alarmists like Heidi Cullen, formerly of the Weather Channel, want you to believe that heat waves, extreme storms, and other terrible things are going to come kill you. And there's a picture of New York drowning. And she's a scientist, so you simply aren't qualified to question anything that she says. But Heidi Cullen didn't really need to make that picture of Manhattan drowning, because here's the exact same story from 85 years ago. She could have just recycled this story from 1934. Well, melting icebergs engulf the world, and there's Manhattan underwater, just like in her picture. Manhattan being underwater is a popular theme for climate alarmists. Here's the same story from Salon magazine in 2001. It's a discussion with James Hansen, the NASA scientist who started the global warming scare before Congress in 1988. While doing research 12 or 13 years ago, I met Jim Hansen, the scientist who in 1988 predicted the greenhouse effect before Congress. I went over to the window with him and looked out on Broadway in New York City and said, if what you're saying about the greenhouse effect is true, is anything going to look different down there in 20 years? He looked for a while and was quiet and didn't say anything for a couple seconds. Then he said, well, there will be more traffic. I of course didn't think he heard the question right. Then he explained, the West Side Highway, which runs along the Hudson River, will be underwater. And there will be tape across the windows across the street because of high winds, and the same birds won't be there. The trees in the median strip will change. Then he said, there will be more police cars. Why? Well, you know what happens to crime when the heat goes up. And so far over the last 10 years, we've had 10 of the hottest years on record. Didn't he also say that restaurants would have signs in their windows that read, water by request only? Under the greenhouse effect, extreme weather increases. Depending on where you are in terms of the hydrological cycle, you get more of whatever you're prone to get. New York can get droughts, the droughts can get more severe, and you'll have signs in restaurants saying, water by request only. When did he say this will happen? Within 20 or 30 years, and remember we had this conversation in 1988 or 1989. Does he still believe these things? Yes, he still believes everything. I talked to him a few months ago and he said he wouldn't change anything that he said then. I'm pretty sure that they still have windows in Manhattan and that the birds there are the same as they were 30 years ago. But the part I found really amusing was where he said that restaurants would have signs saying, water by request only. The reason this is funny for me is because I used to spend summers with my grandparents on Long Island in the 1960s. The Northeast was having a terrible drought in the 1960s and New York did almost run out of water. And restaurants in New York were required to have a sign up which said, water by request only. This is the NOAA drought graph for the northeastern United States. Green represents wet and brown represents dry. You can see that before 1970 the Northeast was in drought most of the time. But since then it's been very wet in the Northeast, and drought really isn't even a consideration anymore. So the world's leading climate expert James Hansen was wrong about Manhattan drowning, he was wrong about the drought, he's been wrong about just about everything. And that's why climate alarmists love him so much. He says exactly what they want him to say, and he's completely unaffected by the truth. So let's get back to sea level. Here's an article from the Washington Post 3 years ago, and they say, democracy dies in darkness, carefully placed on a dark banner. Seas are now rising faster than they have in 2,800 years, scientists say. When a journalist uses the word scientists say, it's normally an appeal to authority. It means turn your brain off, you aren't qualified to question what you're about to read. A group of scientists says it has now reconstructed the history of the planet's sea levels arcing back some 3,000 years, leading it to conclude that the rate of increase experienced in the 20th century was extremely likely to have been faster than during nearly the entire period. The sentence structure and grammar in this paragraph is almost unreadable, but even worse is the junk science. We can say with 95% probability that the 20th century rise was faster than any of the previous 27 centuries, said Bob Kopp, a climate scientist at Rutgers University, who led the research with 9 colleagues from several U.S. and global universities. Wow, 10 scientists from around the world. How could they possibly be wrong? Seas rose about 14 centimeters, 5.5 inches from 1900 to 2000, the new study suggests, for a rate of 1.4 millimeters per year. The current rate, according to NASA, is 3.4 millimeters per year, suggesting that sea level rise is still accelerating. So according to the study, sea level rise rates have more than doubled over the last 19 years. That sounds really bad. We must all be about to drown. And they say that sea level rise rates during the 20th century were fastest in the last 2,800 years. But wait a minute, in the first UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report, they said the exact opposite. The IPCC said there is no convincing evidence of an acceleration in global sea level rise during the 20th century. Well, perhaps the authors of the new study went back in time a century and took some new measurements. Later in this video, I'm going to show you that determining whether or not sea level rise is accelerating is trivial. There's a very simple technique to determine whether or not sea level rise is accelerating, which I'll be showing you shortly. But first, let's look at a few other things. This is the graph of sea level rise over the last 20,000 years. 20,000 years ago, sea level was 120 meters or 400 feet lower. From 14,000 years ago until 8,000 years ago, sea level rose very quickly, and over the past 8,000 years it's been rising very slowly. Climate alarmists want you to believe that this 400 feet of sea level rise is all natural, but the last few inches is man-made. Let's zoom in on the last 140 years with the current NASA sea level rise graph. The graph has an upwards curvature indicating that sea level rise is accelerating. If it was a straight line, that would indicate that sea level rise is not accelerating. If it was curving downward, that would mean that sea level rise is decelerating. This aspect of the upwards curvature is very important for the discussion moving forward. I plotted 3 different trend lines on the graph. The first one is 1880 to 1940, 1.2 millimeters per year. The second one is 1940 to 1990, much faster, at 2.0 millimeters per year. And now they show sea level rise out of control at 4.0 millimeters per year. So they show more than tripling of sea level rise rates over the past century. NASA shows that sea level is currently rising about 4 millimeters per year, but NOAA tells a completely different story. They say it's 1.7 to 1.8 millimeters per year, or less than half of what NASA is showing in their graph. So why all this confusion? Either lower Manhattan is underwater as NASA's James Hansen predicted in 1988, or it isn't. And either sea level rise accelerated during the 20th century as the new study claims, or it didn't as the IPCC said in their first report. Let's look at this in more detail. This is the NASA sea level graph from 1982, authored by James Hansen. Instead of showing an upwards curvature like the current NASA graph shows, it showed the exact opposite, a downwards curvature, indicating that sea level rise was decelerating, not accelerating. In fact, the 1982 NASA graph showed that sea level didn't rise at all from about 1950 until the mid-1970s. This next chart overlays the NASA 1982 sea level graph on the current NASA graph. The current NASA graph shows a sharp acceleration upwards after 1940, whereas the 1982 graph showed a downwards acceleration. The difference between these two graphs is pretty stunning and should give us a big hint that something is seriously wrong here. And we get a hint at the bottom of the 1982 study by James Hansen. It said, "The sea level response to this warming should be carefully determined to aid our understanding of the processes and to allow early detection of any nonlinear response." So NASA was expecting an upwards curvature, and when it didn't happen, they simply changed the data. Now we're going to take a closer look at the mathematics of detecting sea level rise. This chart was in the 1982 NASA paper. It shows sea level rise rates at different parts of the world. You can see that it varies quite a bit. Some places like the west coast of North America, they show very low sea level rise rates. Other places like Southern Europe, they show much higher rates, and in Scandinavia, they show sea level falling very quickly. I'm going to explain how this can be in a minute, but first I want to point something out to you. Hansen chose to exclude the numbers from Scandinavia from the global average. I'm pretty sure that Scandinavia is part of the globe. The reason that Hansen chose to exclude Scandinavia is because the numbers were negative and was going to drag down the averages, which was the opposite of what he was trying to show. In most fields of science, this would be grounds for termination, but in climate science, it's standard practice. In order to understand sea level rise, first we have to discuss a couple of very basic scientific principles. The first one is that water seeks a level surface. When water flows into the level of the lake rises everywhere. That's why the surface of the lake is flat. During the spring, when you get a lot of water coming down into the lake whole lake is going to go up. And perhaps later in the summer, the whole lake will go down. But the whole surface of the lake moves together. But in measuring sea level, some places have sea level rapidly falling, and other places have sea level rapidly rising. How can this be? That leads us into our second scientific principle, and that's that motion is relative. I'm going to show you a short video of something we're all familiar with. Which one of these trains is moving? At the beginning of the video, the train we were on was moving, and at the end it was the other train that was moving, but we had no way of detecting when that change occurred. With sea level, we have exactly the same problem. When it looks like sea level is rising, it could actually be because the land was going down. And when sea level is falling, it could actually be because the land was rising. For example, these mountains were formed by the land rising. Greta Thunburg has been taught that she's going to drown in Sweden because of sea level rise, but the reality is that the land in Sweden is actually rising very quickly, so sea level appears to be falling very fast there. Other places like the U.S. Gulf Coast appear to have very high rates of sea level rise, when in fact what's going on there is that the land is sinking very quickly. So determining the average rate of sea level rise around the world is actually very complicated because you have land going up, you have land going down, you have the ocean going up. And between those three things, it's very difficult to sort out what is actual sea level rise. This graph shows all of the sea level rise or fall rates at all of the NOAA tide gauges around the world. In Canada, sea level appears to be falling very rapidly, and that's because the land is rising. In Japan, sea level appears to be rising very rapidly, and that's because the land is sinking. And on a side note, 81% of the NOAA tide gauges are below the NASA average, indicating that the NASA average is meaningless. So as I think you can see, determining the average sea level rise around the world is actually a very difficult problem. However, determining whether or not sea level rise is accelerating is actually extremely easy. This is the sea level graph for Lower Manhattan since before Abraham Lincoln was president. As you can see, sea level there is rising linearly. There is no upwards curvature, which would indicate an acceleration. There's also no downwards curvature, which would indicate a deceleration. The line is straight, which indicates that sea level has been rising at the same rate for 150 years. Not only is Lower Manhattan not underwater as Hansen predicted, there's no indication that man has had any influence on sea level rise rates there. Let's look at some other places. Key West, Florida shows exactly the same thing, a linear rate of sea level rise for over 100 years. There's no upwards acceleration. Stockholm, Sweden appears to show a rapid rate of sea level decline. That's actually caused by the land rising very quickly. But once again, what's important is that there's no upwards curvature. Greta is quite safe from the climate and sea level rise in Sweden. The danger she faces is from adults around her who are scaring her intentionally for propaganda purposes. Here's the tide gauge from Crescent City in California. It appears to show sea level falling, but once again that's because of the land surface rising. However, it does not show any upwards curvature, just like all the other graphs. And this is Sydney Harbor at Fort Denison. They have 130 years of tide gauge records which show very little sea level rise and definitely no acceleration. There is no upwards curvature. This is what Fort Denison and Sydney Harbor looks like now, and this is what it looked like in the 19th century. There is no indication of sea level rise at Fort Denison. So climate alarmists will of course jump in here and say, he's just cherry-picking graphs. He picked ones which didn't show any acceleration. But that's just nonsense. Remember our other scientific principle that water seeks a level surface. All the oceans are interconnected. If the polar ice caps were dumping a lot more water into the ocean than they used to, every single tide gauge in the world would have an upwards curvature. I've never seen any long-term tide gauges which show an upwards curvature. It also tells us that the 2019 NASA sea level graph is completely fraudulent. It shows an upwards curvature which doesn't exist in any of the tide gauges. That's mathematically impossible. What NASA's doing is they're averaging a whole bunch of zeros and getting a non-zero number. So I'm going to show you how they most likely created the upwards curvature. If over time they shifted their selection of stations towards the right, they would create the appearance that sea level rise was accelerating. Suppose that when they're doing their calculations for years more than 50 years ago, they used mostly stations on this side, and for the more recent years they used stations on this side, they would create the appearance that sea level rise was accelerating, when in fact all that they're doing is mathematical tricks. In 1988, experts predicted that the Maldives would be underwater in 30 years. Well, this is what the Maldives look like now. Barack Obama spent a lot of his time in office trying to scare people about climate and sea level rise, but they just purchased a $15 million home on Martha's Vineyard right above sea level. Obviously, they don't believe what they're saying. They're putting their money where their mouth isn't. This is what the beach at Fort Lauderdale looked like in 1960 when they were filming the movie Where the Boys Are. And this is what it looks like now. Doesn't look too catastrophic. This animation shows La Jolla, California beach in 1871, transitioning to a high tide photograph from the present. You can see that there's been essentially no change in sea level at La Jolla since 1871. So I think the Obamas are pretty safe with their purchase. Water seeks a level surface. If sea level rise is not accelerating in California, it's definitely not accelerating in Massachusetts either. The land at Martha's Vineyard is subsiding slowly, creating the appearance of sea level rise, but they have a long time before that's going to be a problem. These claims of catastrophic man-made sea level rise are complete nonsense, and scaring children over their lives is completely despicable, but that's what we've come to expect from climate alarmists. Visit Toto on the web at realclimatescience.com. He's been pulling back the curtain on junk science and propaganda for a long time.